Hey everybody, it's Johnny Two-Face here, back with another reaction video. This time reacting to what was the 1756 diplomatic revolution by House of History. Now this is still part of the Frederick the Great series, or History of Prussia series if you want to call it that, from House of History, but if you haven't seen my reaction to the other episodes in this series, I suggest you check them out before checking this one out. And but before we move on to the next famous battle in this series about Frederick the Great and Prussia, I thought it'd be important if I react to this because it's in order, not just because it's in order, but also it might provide me useful intel in going forward when reacting to this series. So anyway, the usual disclaimer when I react to anything historical, if I don't show so much what is considered a proper reaction, is probably obvious I don't know much about the subject at hand, and if I do know anything, I'll most likely pause the video to give my input or ask any curious questions, which hopefully will be answered in the comments below. So, without further ado, the link to the original video will be in the description down below. Please go and subscribe to House of History, check them out, subscribe to the channel and support them, and please feel free to check out their other content as well, because I've been loving their channel so far. So without further ado, let's get this up on screen and let's get into this. 1748 to 1756.
In the 1740s, many European states were astonished at the outcome of the two Silesian Wars, both in terms of speed and success. The at best minor principality Prussia took on Austria, the Holy Roman Empire's strongest dynasty and one of the critical great powers of the European continent. Prussia was one of the many German principalities. It wasn't the wealthiest, it certainly didn't have the most resources, and its disjointed territories did not hint at it becoming more than a historical footnote of the Holy Roman Empire. The success also made it a prime target,
as I said before, was neither Roman or holy,
for its enemies, who had not forgotten nor forgiven Prussia, and especially its King Frederick's conduct. He began a war without a legitimate cause, abandoned alliances whenever he saw fit, and betrayed the Habsburg monarchy several times, suing for peace, but not adhering to it whatsoever. At any rate, he was a gambler. Fortunately for him, in case of Silesia, it had paid off, and through this conduct, Prussia defeated all.
Just like Napoleon, he was a gambler as well. His good fortune only lasts for so long, so see how long this goes on for.
Austria. However, Prussia's victory wasn't necessarily the result of great strategic insight and resolute leadership, at least not initially. Frederick's father, Frederick William, the Soldier King, spent his entire reign augmenting and expanding the Prussian infantry. When he passed away in 1740, his son inherited a relatively enormous, well-disciplined and well-drilled army. In battle, the Prussian infantry proved superior to the Austrians and Saxons. Their skill compensated for Frederick's initial lackluster command of battle. For example, during the April 1741 Battle of Mollwitz, the Prussians were put on the back foot, and Frederick's general, von Schwerin, recommended the king to flee the battlefield, which he promptly did. It was only thanks to the relentless advance of the Prussian infantry in the face of adversity that the Prussians came out on top. 1 year later, at the May 1742 Battle of Chotusitz, this pattern repeated itself, although credit to Frederick is due that he undoubtedly learned from his mistakes. To begin with, it confirmed the suspicions that Prussian cavalry wasn't able to compete with the Austrians. It was only thanks to the flexibility and the discipline of, once again, Prussia's infantry that the battle was turned and they emerged victoriously. By the time...
Sort of similar, but I might be wrong about this. Like the Swedish infantry during the Northern War, the Great Northern War. Sorry, they were well disciplined with hand-to-hand combat and getting right into the thick of it. So,
time the Second Silesian War erupted at Hohenfriedberg, Frederick proved himself an able strategist. He adapted to ever-changing circumstances, and once again his infantry secured the victory for Prussia. What made Prussia's victory all the more impressive was that Prussia's fellow principalities Bavaria and Saxony fared much worse during and in the aftermath of the war. Bavaria's elector had to flee his electorate when the Austrians invaded. The Saxons changed sides in the middle of the war, only to lose to the Prussians at Hohenfriedberg, Soor, and Kesselsdorf.
Wow.
3 years after Prussia made peace, financial exhaustion led to other participants of the war to sign the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, ending the war. In it, it confirmed Prussia's sovereignty over Silesia. Well, sort of. Despite the acquisition, Prussia's adversaries were already plotting how to seize Silesia and tear up the entire kingdom, which had humiliated both Austria and Prussia's wronged allies. Austria felt especially vicious. Frankly, the 8-year-long peace that followed was nothing more than a truce. Destroying Prussia became the foremost objective of the Habsburg monarchy. This anger is understandable if we consider Silesia's qualities. Thanks to its well-developed agricultural and textile industrial infrastructure, its abundance of resources and minerals, and its size, nearly 1/3 of the size of England, it was a significant loss. Relatively speaking, Silesia contributed the most to the Habsburg monarchy's coffers, around 25%. Its 1.1 million inhabitants added 1/3 to Prussia's population, and thus conscriptable men. Under Prussian rule, the province contributed nearly half of the crown's revenue, not to mention its strategic geographic value. Its loss caused the Habsburg monarchy to lose its influence in northern Germany, while Prussia gained a springboard to Prague and even Vienna. In addition, the many fortresses were robust and welcomed frontier defense. I won't go into too much detail, but the sources in the description offer a very detailed account of Austria's reorientation of foreign policy in the aftermath of the war. Christopher Clark provides a neat overview. In short, championed by the youngest cabinet member, Count Kaunitz, rapprochement with France became official Habsburg policy. Kaunitz argued that despite Austria's traditional enemy being France, and its traditional ally being Britain, this should be reversed now that it became clear the objectives of Britain as a maritime power were too distinct from continental Austria's. Additionally, the multilingual nature of the empire was a weakness, and the Habsburgs should focus on the German lands. Kaunitz's proposal was twice as long as the proposals of the other ministers combined, and he was on his own. The proposal was controversial, bold, and radical, but Maria Theresa decided to embrace it nonetheless. Kaunitz rose through the ranks during the following years, becoming Austria's ambassador to Versailles and becoming the Habsburg monarchy's state chancellor in 1753. He preoccupied himself with smoothing things over with their traditional enemy, France, and he did, successfully. The Habsburg monarchy also found a sympathetic Russia, whose Tsarina Elizabeth and her advisors were alarmed by the sudden rapid rise of Prussia, especially its potential expansion in the Baltic. Using the Duchy of Prussia as a springboard wasn't sitting well with them. 2 years before the war ended, Prussia had already signed an alliance with Austria, explicitly mentioning how the Hohenzollern monarchy was to be partitioned in case of its defeat. King August of Poland, doubling as Saxony's elector, also continued his alliance with Austria. Sweden too eagerly joined the Habsburgs, for they stood to regain Pomerania in northern Germany. Militarily, Austria enjoyed multiple reforms. The most striking and essential for the 7 Years' War is its reform in artillery. The Austrian Prince Joseph Wendel von Liechtenstein personally financed a radical improvement of the artillery wing of the Habsburg army. When they saw combat again in 1756, their adversaries definitely noticed it was not the same Austrian army they faced during the Silesian Wars. Frederick knew and understood there were forces at play he had no control over. Sure, he had won, but his victory arguably landed him in more dangerous waters. Before the ink of the peace treaty was dry, he already began preparing for the next war, dryly remarking, "The ant amasses in summer what it consumes in winter." He spent the 11 years between the Second Silesian War and the 7 Years' War outbreak improving his army.
Wow.
This already began between the First and the Second Silesian War, and during peacetime.
I remember that. What little I remember was the 7 Years' War was another conflict between Britain and France, but was over here in the UK. When it comes to 7 Years' War, it mostly talks about like in the USA when like back when the USA had just got its own country, being independent from Britain, because it used to be known basically as the 13 colonies. And I think after getting their after they got their independence, like all they talked about sorry, I had a bit of a brain fart then. Most of what was talked about was the war between Britain and France during the 7 Years' War, and this was based what is now the United States, and it was like a breakouts of war between Britain and France across the entire world, especially in the American colonies. I'm sorry if I didn't word that very well. It's just I had the words in my head and they just vanished.
Prussia's regiments continued their brutal training regimen.
Mm-hmm.
Prussia's autumn war games were conducted in Silesia because Frederick and his advisors expected a future war to take place there. Prussian cavalry, artillery, and technical arms received most of the improvements, for the condition of the infantry was still among the greatest in Europe. Frederick knew this and also became a little bit complacent. He mistakenly believed whenever his infantry advanced, he would emerge victoriously. But reality would soon prove him wrong. Besides this, peacetime saw another radical shift in Prussia's military. Frederick drilled his cavalry so that its quality became unparalleled in Europe.
Wow.
He did this the same way his father had prepared the infantry. Soldiers had to ride their horses daily, even in peacetime. It was a simple recipe, drilling, and even more drilling, but it worked. By the 1750s, his dragoons and cuirassier regiments could gallop and charge with the horses touching each other. In addition, cavalry commanders knew Frederick would have them court-martialed if they suffered an enemy's charge while stationary. Lastly, commanders were at liberty to direct their attacks and maneuvers without awaiting official orders, as long as they thought an opportunity presented itself. Frederick embarked on an energetic diplomatic mission to guarantee alliances during the interbellum. His main priority was to appease Russia, remarking to his envoy in St. Petersburg that there is nothing in the world I would not do to maintain in perpetuity harmonious relations with the Russian Empire. Unfortunately for Frederick, the Prussophobe vice-chancellor, Count Alexei Bestujev, blocked every attempt at reconciliation. When Tsarina Elizabeth promoted him to Grand Chancellor, the situation worsened. Up until the outbreak of the war, there was no point in attempting to conclude an alliance with Russia. His Vienna intelligence reports detailing Kaunitz's plans didn't offer much hope either, but stubborn as he was, and as we will see, still lacking tact as a statesman, he let his personal biases get the best of him. Frederick was convinced of the natural hostility between the French Bourbons on one side and the Austrian Habsburgs on the other, until far too late. There was no way an anti-Prussian alliance could ever materialize between these two states. His French ally would support him without a doubt, despite his defections during the Silesian Wars. Meanwhile, around the world, things were heating up between England and France.
Again.
There were skirmishes in the New World, India, and Africa.
The 7 Years' War
caused massive shockwaves, which continental Europe would feel for years to come. France saw its colony, Canada, threatened by the British. By 1754, war seemed inevitable to both parties. Although Britain was a maritime power with its eyes set on the New World, King George II had significant interests in continental Europe. His homeland, the Principality of Hanover, was in potential danger against France and its traditional but unreliable ally Prussia. George figured, to prevent France from invading Hanover, he required a distraction. Austria and Russia were critical in this. But negotiations between Austria and Britain collapsed. The interests of both great powers and traditional allies were too diverse. Maritime Britain looked at the New World, and continental Austria had no real interest outside of Europe.
Wow.
Diplomatic changes were slow to materialize, but this period, the diplomatic revolution, saw most great and minor powers realize their interests diverged too much from their traditional allies. Alliances, sometimes centuries old, were beginning to show cracks or fall through. Russia was still a potential ally for the British. Their envoy to St. Petersburg offered Elizabeth to finance their army and fleet as long as they promised to keep the Duchy of Prussia preoccupied. The 1755 Treaty of St. Petersburg put this agreement into writing. Britain agreed to subsidize Russia with £100,000 if they promised to hold an army of 50,000 and 50 galleys stationed on its western frontier. In case of an outbreak of war, Britain would pay an extra £400,000. Elizabeth was slow to ratify this treaty, however. It is an understatement to say Frederick was unnerved when he learned of these plans. Having always respected Russia's strength, he embarked on the diplomatic route to assure George he would leave Hanover alone. Anglo-Prussian relations improved in the years preceding this, and in part thanks to the Tsarina's slow ratification, George was receptive to a defensive agreement with Prussia. At the January 1756 Convention of Westminster, Prussia and England signed a defensive alliance. Despite the treaty not necessarily being a direct threat against any other power, it led to an all-out war over the entire world. It doesn't take a geopolitical expert to see this hastily concluded treaty was a monumental mistake on Frederick's part. The Russians were angry as the British suddenly halted their subsidies thanks to the conduct of the very state the subsidies were directed against. Enraged, the Tsarina eagerly searched for any alliance against Prussia. Betraying the French for so many times, and even joining a pact against his former ally, well, it was considered a cardinal sin. The anti-Prussian sentiment at Versailles increased, and Louis XV refused to listen to anyone who did not hate Prussia and its king. With the Habsburg attempts to reconcile their relationship with Versailles, Frederick's acts were the final push France required to consider Austria as its ally. Things moved very rapidly. 3 months after signing the Treaty of Westminster, France signed a defensive alliance with Austria. Both parties promised each other significant military aid in the event of an attack against one of them. Russia obviously learned of this and happily joined them, becoming the leading proponent of an all-out war. Prussia was, quite literally, encircled. Now, the Triple Alliance of Austria, France and Russia agreed that they would reduce Prussia to the Margravate of Brandenburg. They would share the rest of the territory among them. These aims weren't too ambitious, considering it was 3 great powers facing a much smaller, not real great power. Britain's theaters of war were on the other side of the world, and there lay Frederick's Prussia, isolated in Central Europe, surrounded by 3 enemies. And each of these enemies had a bigger army than Prussia had. War was returning to Europe, and everyone knew it. This video is an epilogue on my series on the first 2 Silesian Wars. After these events, the 7 Years' War broke out, which will be covered from the Battle of Lobositz all the way to the end. Thank you very much for watching this video, and the entire documentary about the first 2 Silesian Wars. I'm really looking forward to covering the 7 Years' War in detail. I would also really like to thank all my patrons
and that'll do it. This has been another interesting video by House of History, another well done video, and yeah, so I will definitely be reacting to more of this series about Frederick the Great and Prussia, so there's not much more I can add to that. If you like this reaction, please like, comment and subscribe, and I'll see you next.